Welcome to a demonstration video for the SANS Institute. This demonstration video is going to cover a little bit about the WebScarab tool that's used for doing web application testing and auditing. The SANS Institute runs several different classes that deal with web penetration testing, that deal with web application programming, but we also have two classes that deal with auditing. Audit 507, which does advanced system auditing, and Audit 521 that takes care of PCI compliance. In this video today, we're going to take a look at some demonstrations of how the WebScarab tool can be used to do some web application testing. Now, in the SANS Audit 507 class, we actually have an entire full day devoted to using, well, not just this tool, others as well, but devoted to doing web application testing from a security auditor's standpoint. And in Audit 521, we just briefly introduced this topic, and in fact, this demonstration video is used as a part of the class to help on-demand students see what's possible using this type of tool. So with that background out of the way, let's get started here and taking a look at the actual tool. So the tool that we're going to be using is called WebScarab, and in using the tool, we've got a demonstration web application that we actually make available through one of the virtual machines that you obtain in the class. Now this virtual machine has this tool installed that was actually written by David Rhodes. So this is his tool. It's a very, very useful tool. He's from Maven Security. He's a web application testing professional. He does quite a bit of this. And put this application together to demonstrate many of the vulnerabilities that are extremely common to find in web applications today. The tool that we're using to do the testing is actually called WebScarab. So here we can see I've already got it installed. This is a Java-based tool, which is very handy for us because it means that we can get this tool to run on just about any platform we face today, provided we have a Java runtime environment. Now this particular interface, we're running on a Macintosh here, so the interface does look a little bit different than what you'll find on a Windows machine because of differences in the Java virtual machine. For instance, in a Windows machine, these will appear will look more like tabs, though you can see here it's just a long string of different menu options that are available. And we can move between them, or we can even just click specifically on the one that we'd like to find. To use this tool, it's very important to make sure that our web browser is configured properly. This tool acts as a man-in-the-middle proxy, allowing us to intercept web requests as they're passing from the web browser to the server. It's also possible, of course, to intercept the responses coming back from the server, though that's much less interesting in terms of doing testing. In order to get it to work properly, though, we have to make sure our browser is configured to use the right proxy listener. So by moving here into the Proxy tab and under Listeners, we can see that there is currently a listener running on 127.0.0.1 and port 8008. So if you don't have one running, you can just start one up. Down here, actually, you can configure a proxy to listen, and you can even control the speed of that, so you can simulate, for instance, the speed of a modem to see what some of your customers might be seeing in looking at your web application. But for us, we're interested in reconfiguring our server, our browser, to make sure that it's going through this proxy. So I see it's at 127.0.0.1, port 8008. What I'm going to do is switch back over to Safari, the web browser I'm using here, and I'm going to open up the preferences for that. Now the preferences I'm looking for turn out to be under the advanced settings in Safari. Of course, if you're using a different browser, you just have to take a look at what your proxy settings would be. They're often under the Tools menu, under Settings, or sometimes under the Edit menu, under Preferences. And then just go and find out where the proxy settings are. Now for Safari, it turns out that the proxy settings are not actually inside of the browser. They're actually implemented in the the operating system itself. So I'm going to turn on the web proxy and the secure web proxy, which means that my regular web traffic and my SSL traffic are both going to try to go through a proxy. And then I can configure these individually and change, in this case, just the port number. The port number is going to be 8008, and I'm going to make sure that both of them are configured the same way, so that if I end up handling any SSL pages, those will also be going through that proxy. Once those settings are set, I can simply click OK and then apply that and close up my network settings. Get rid of my preferences. And now I'm going to refresh this page. Now what hopefully has happened, I can see that my page here refreshed, everything looked okay, but hopefully what's happened is over in WebScarab, If I switch to the summary page, I can now see that there has actually been a request that was processed through WebScarab. That is exactly what I was looking for. So I can see now that WebScarab is acting as a proxy. From the point of view of the user, of course, everything is still the same. Nothing has changed. But from the point of view of us as a tester, I can now see everything that's going back and forth. In fact, if I select one of these and right-click on it, I can choose to, for instance, show the conversation. And when I do so, let me just make this window a little bit smaller so it'll fit in our screen here. When I show that conversation, I can see all of the details of how this request was made. For instance, I can see all of the different HTTP headers that were sent from the client to the server. Now, of course, this is a little bit compressed because of us trying to do this as an online video. On your screen, of course, you'll have your entire screen to work with, so you'll get a lot more data. Personally, I find it easier to look at the raw values, though, than I do to look at the parsed values, because this is actually what the web server is going to see. So my web client just sent this request, and here is all of the HTTP that made this happen. So I can see the URL that was requested right up here. I can see how the HTTP request was sent. It's using version 1.1. I see some information about my browser. I can also see how caching is going to be handled. And down here I can see some other things like the actual host I'm connecting to. Now the IP address of the host you use will probably be different. I'm using a different set of virtual machines here, but I have the same virtual image installed. I have the same web application. At the bottom, we can see the response that was sent from the server to the client. And again, you can look at this as the raw data, and if you look down here in the bottom under HTML, if I scroll down, I know it's very small, but you can see that we've actually got the entire web page down here because it's parsing it out right now as HTML. Though you can choose to view that as XML, for instance, or just raw text, or personally, again, I'll view it as raw because now I can see the HTTP headers that were sent back, and I can see the raw HTML. So at this point, keep in mind, we are looking at a proxy here. We're not actually looking in the browser. So this is now stored content that's kept track of here in the WebScarab interface. And every time I make a request, it's going to update in the interface here and show me what's happened. There's actually quite a bit that we can do to do web application testing. Let me just give you a few pointers of a couple of things that can be tested. For instance, one of the first things I'll do is switch over to the Proxy tab, and I want to reconfigure the proxy so that it does some special things for me. So under the Miscellaneous tab, notice here that there's an option to prevent the browser from caching content. Now, I've already got that turned on. It's not turned on by default, but in doing testing of applications, it's a very critical option to turn on because this is going to prevent you from seeing old content in your browser while you're doing your testing. In other words, what could happen is you might actually find a vulnerability, but you can't tell because your browser is showing you old content. This forces you to always get new content in your browser. With that turned on, I'm going to go in and make a couple of other changes to the manual edit settings. But we're going to first take a look at the web application and how it responds in a couple of instances so that we can see what's really happening. Now you'll notice that for Buggy Bank, it actually provides you with account information right on the main page. But I'm not going to make use of that just yet. First, I want to do some very basic testing to see what's happening with, for instance, some input validation, and also to see if perhaps I can bypass the authentication and maybe see if there's a broken authorization system. So let me click on the login button here. That'll take me to the login page. And at this point, I haven't bothered to get any accurate account information. So I'm just going to put some numbers in there, and I'm just going to jam in a PIN number. And I know this data is not valid. But that's okay. I'm just starting my testing. So I'm going to click the Submit button. And no big surprise, it tells me, I'm sorry, you've got an invalid account number. Well, this is actually a bad thing here. It probably shouldn't tell me I have an invalid account number. It should probably just tell me you've got invalid authentication information. That would be much better. So right there is a little bit of a vulnerability. It's something you would look for in auditing an application. But let's look at this a little bit more closely. I wonder what would happen if I go back into WebScarab, and this time Whoops, where's WebScarab? There it is. And this time I turn on the Intercept Requests option. Now what that means is that anytime, notice we've got a couple of methods highlighted here, anytime there is a GET request or a POST request, we're going to intercept that and allow the user to do some changes here, to essentially make any change they like. We can also more specifically choose which pages to see or not to see. For instance, I'm not interested in editing any pictures or Flash format files or anything like that, so I can tell it to ignore those. Now, what are all these different functions here? What's a GET? What's a POST? Now, those are things that we actually cover in the 507 class, so we're not going to get into that here because this is just the demonstration. But let me show you what happens with that option turned on. I'll now put in a PIN number, and I'm sorry, I just had a window pop up in the back here because my browser is trying to go out and do an RSS update. So let me abort that, and I've got another one here. It's apparently trying to do, oh, I know what's happening here. This is my RSS feeds all updating. So let me get these all out of the way. There we go. Yep. And my goodness, they are persistent. Let me close my RSS feeds. That'll solve the problem for me. All right, come on back here. All right, so now we're ready to go. I've got the intercept turned on. Let me go back into Safari, and again, I'll just submit this, but now another window opens up. The window that we have here has half of a conversation, because what we have right now is a request. We can see it up here, the request, and we currently have that turned on. And again, we can view it as either parsed data, or my preference, we can look at it as raw data. And looking at the raw data, I'd like to draw your attention to the top here, where we can see the GET request. Here's the URL that's being requested. And we can see some things in here that are concerning. For instance, for PCI compliance, notice up here, we've got the username and password being sent in the URL. Even for general security, this is a terrible idea. One of the reasons being that this is now going to be stored in the web access log in clear text. So that's a clear violation of the PCI standard. Another thing that we notice here is that there's another field here called transaction, and it's currently set to be login. Now, I'd like to just pause for a moment and point something out. Actually, I took too long because of my RSS feeds. Notice that this says just failed. It's just said, I'm sorry, I failed to open the page. My web browser ended up waiting too long. You actually do have a limited amount of time to make changes in WebScarab. Let me go back. I'm just going to resubmit that. So you have to get it done in about a minute or so. So don't take forever to do this, which is what we're doing here. So let me come back to the transaction. So in the background here, my web browser is waiting. You can see the little icon is spinning around. It's waiting for the page to come back. But on this page, there's nothing that says transaction. In fact, the transaction value is a hidden field on that page. I wonder what would happen if I told it, I don't want to log in. What I'd like to do is do a, oh, I've got another one popping in here. Let me get this out of the way. What I'd like to do is now trying to do my my Mac syncs there are all getting in the way. What I'd like to do is I would like to send in a transaction of balance, and I'll click Accept Changes. Now, nothing will happen here in the WebScarab window. We need to take a look at what's happening in the web browser. Now, notice what's happened. It now says to me, I'm sorry, I don't know what that transaction is, but you could do a funds transfer or an account summary, or you could log out. Remember we said we were talking about authorization here, and perhaps even an authentication issue, broken authorization? We've just found it. We have not yet entered a valid username and password, yet it takes us to a page that says here are valid transactions. For instance, you could try a fund transfer. Well, let's try that, fund transfer. Now, it is again going to pop up the WebScarab page. In this case, I don't want to make any changes, so I'm just going to accept that. Move these guys back out of the way. I'll accept this one as well. This is the same thing. And notice it comes back and says, hey, you tried to do a transfer here, but I can't find your balance. Now, that's no big surprise because we haven't logged in. But we haven't logged in and we're interacting with the application. So using this kind of tool, we can very, very quickly do some basic testing on the application to see if there are flaws. Of course, this application has the flaws built into it. They're designed in. but it's not unique in having these kinds of problems. Let me show you just one or two other things that you can do with WebScarab that are very powerful for doing some fast testing on our applications. Here in WebScarab, among the other options that are up on the top here, we have one that's called Session ID Analysis. This is an incredibly valuable feature. Now, there are some tools that do some more advanced testing than what WebScarab is doing, but as a first test, this is a phenomenal tool to use. What this tool allows us to do is take a look at what's happening with our session IDs that are being generated in our web applications and to see whether or not they're appropriate. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about in the 507 class and that we touch on briefly in the 521 class is the matter of having a strong session ID. Well, we can check out and see how strong the session ID is. To do it, let me go back over to the summary page. And what I'm looking for is something very particular. I'm going to take a look over here. I'm sorry, let me switch that back so that we're sorted by time. I'm going to take a look over here at one of the other columns. Notice there's a whole bunch of columns that show you the kind of data that's going back and forth. For instance, it notes a page that might have a possible injection flaw, pages where cross-site scripting may be possible. But over here, we've got a set cookie field. Now that's what I'm looking for, because on this particular application, let me open up this conversation. In this conversation, you can see that in the response down here, we have a set cookie field. That set cookie is going to set a cookie on the client, and in this particular case, notice the name of it. The name is Session ID. So here's how the session is being tracked. One of the many ways that can be used is using cookies, and that's the case here. Now, what I want to take note of is the conversation number. This is conversation number 10. I can see it here, and it's also listed on the top. In this page back over here, I can also see it's conversation number 10. The reason I want that information is because that's where the session ID is set, and what I'd like to do is, instead of building a request by hand, I'd like to just pull down this pull-down menu here and choose conversation number 10. And what I'm telling it is, send this request, the request that was sent in conversation 10, and what you should get back is a session ID. Well, let's test it out. I'll click the test button, and it comes back and tells me, hey, I found a session ID. There it is. WebScarab is very, very good at finding session IDs and cookies. You can also find session IDs using things right out of the body. So we could turn this on, give it a name, and define a regular expression to go and extract it out of the body of the response. For instance, maybe it's in a hidden form field, so we could find it there too. In this case, we're just going to deal with the one we have. There is one last thing I'd like to do, though. Notice that this session ID ends in a 606. What I'd like to do is just test again and make sure I'm going to get a different session ID. Because sometimes we'll do this and we'll actually end up with the same session ID again and again, because perhaps the session ID was already set and now it's just being sent back to us. So I want to make sure it actually changes. So I'll click test and I get 657. It's different. That's perfect. So with that set, I'm now going to configure this to go and grab, let's say, 200 session IDs. And I'm going to click the fetch button. Now when I click fetch, nothing happens on this page. But if you look under the analysis page, we can now pull down and select that session ID, and we can see, actually you can see the scroll bar changing. It is going and getting session IDs. And if we go to visualization, we can see what those session IDs look like over time. Now what we'd be looking to see for a strong session ID, we'd like to see random values, which means that these would be spread all over, completely random. But what are we seeing? Instead, we're seeing steps. In fact, it looks like we get a new session ID every second, and they're all increasing. So this is a time-based session ID. This is extremely poor. Now, like I said, there are other tools that are more advanced for doing this kind of testing. But just as an example, for a quick test, so we can tell easily if there's an obvious problem, this is a phenomenal way to see what kind of problems we might have with session IDs. So that's it for our demonstration today. If you'd like some more information, feel free to write me. I'd be happy to point you at some of the SANS classes that can help you. Or if you're a student, I'd be happy to help you out with some of the tests. If you haven't taken a class at the SANS Institute, we do recommend that you take a look at them. All of the classes are intense and most of them are hands-on, going through some very powerful and cutting-edge tools that we have today. So again, we're glad that you could be here for our presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us. Have a good day.